Hi, this is Andrew Sears again. Welcome back to Cross-Cultural Management. I'm going to do a deeper dive on one subject that really isn't covered very well in your material, and that's using the combined lenses of race, class, and gender, and looking at a lot of these issues. These terms are often used in the U.S. around justice issues. For those of you who aren't from the U.S., you could substitute ethnicity in place of race because a lot of the same concepts apply. So I'm going to use this grid as a tool to kind of talk about race, class, and gender. You can, identify yourself, where you come from, where your access is. So I come from a white lower class, and I use the term lower class to identify working class and the poor. And middle and upper. So in the class identification, I talked a lot about the different ways you can have different class access, different class identification. So in this term, I'm looking at it in terms of your overall class identity. So you could place yourself somewhere in this grid, right? If you're from the U.S. or some of these terms aren't used as widely in other places. But this is a grid that can be useful. Now, often what happens is people will take one of these perspectives, and they'll take a racialized perspective or a class perspective or a gender perspective. And I want to start by talking about some kingdom principles as we look at race, class, and gender, and then I'm going to apply them. So one of the principles, in the Bible is we're called to identify with the oppressed. So Jesus said he came not for those who are well, but who are sick. There's a lot of passages where he talks about the poor. And how do you characterize what the poor is or the oppressed? I like to look at it in terms of your life chances. So whatever circumstances you were born in, what were your life chances given the groups that you are a part of, race, class, gender, and other environmental factors like neighborhood. And that's kind of where you start, and then you're going to move through life and be in different categories too, right? So we're all called to sacrifice for the oppressed, and that's following the principle that Jesus talked about, where the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So that's principle number one, that we're to identify with the oppressed. Principle number two, and often, people who learn to identify with the oppressed have a harder time on this side, is we're all sinners, and we have to all acknowledge our roles in oppression and have the humility and mercy that comes with that. Now, part of the reason why this is important is sometimes people will go to this grid and they'll say, you know what, I am in the most oppressed category here. I am a black female lower class, so therefore I can't oppress anyone else. Well, that's a fun academic argument to do, and there's some, group counterpart reasons to that. It kind of isn't, doesn't really follow the Bible. It comes from secular ideology. We're all sinners, and we all have roles in oppression, both as individuals and as groups. So one of the things we have to recognize is that there are frameworks, and for someone who runs a school, what I do is I teach people different lenses on life for a living. And you have to realize that every lens, by its nature, is fallen. Every perspective, every framework, it's fallen. It has limitations, including justice frameworks. And they need to be combined with others to have a better understanding. So that's what I like to believe whenever the Bible talks about having a manifold wisdom of God. God can see all of these perspectives at the same time. We can put on one lens at a time. But the identity frameworks, they're extremely helpful. I teach on them. I've studied them a lot, and I've lived them. But our fallen nature is our natural tendency is to emphasize the characteristics of our identity where we were oppressed. So for me, I like to emphasize my social class background and not really talk about the fact that I'm white or male. That's just easier for me, right? Now everyone likes to do that, and the fact that we're both individual and collective, and none of these categories are ever, I would say, solid lines. They're more dotted lines. means that some of us have been on both sides of the fence at some point in our life. And so that's the second principle. We're all sinners, and that's both a group and collective. I mean, both an individual and a group. And the third is we're all called to be reconciled to God, ourselves, and others. So with that, I'm a pragmatic person, and I've, spent the past 40-some years living out trying to do racial, class, and gender reconciliation. And I found this, in the business terms, there's something called the iron triangle that you can use in project management. I would say there's also an iron triangle around race, class, and gender in churches and in ministries. So the iron triangle is generally whatever, you can have whatever idealized theory that you want. You can say, I'm going to have an organization that is world class in race, class, and gender. But I would argue that that's basically like a unicorn. I mean, I've looked at thousands of organizations. I've never come across a unicorn. I've never come across a world class in all three categories because of the fact they live in a fallen world, and to be strong in one category actually is going to bring in some weaknesses in others. So let me explain to you what that looks like. So lower class white churches and ministries. So often they're really good at serving the poor. They don't make the poor feel bad, but they're a lot of their congregants, because they're coming from a poor background, they may not be as educated on all the latest language on race and gender, and they may have more issues there, so they may not be as progressive. So that's where poor whites, you might have the pastor is very adamantly opposed to racism, but you might have congregants. And I've gone to poor white churches, where there's some racism there, and not just, collective, but there's some overt racism. So, churches that are very gender focused and ministries that are very gender focused, I would say, so this is just the original sin in terms of churches, right? So often, these are going to be the congregations that are like mainline denominations, and often, mainline denominations will have more women pastors than just about any other group. But also mainline denominations generally have the most upper class, and usually they're the most white among the denominations. So the most progressive on gender often aren't as strong on race and class. And then you have ethnic churches and ministries. So, black churches, Latino churches, white churches, some will within their race, they'll address class. Often, they will have to be more intentional about dealing with, issues around gender and other things. So it can be challenging to talk about these limitations. People don't want to, say that this becomes a bigger issue. And part of the reason why this can become a bigger issue, where if you develop a church that is focused exclusively on, say, a poor black community, then it's going to be hard supporting the pastor's salary. So you have to also address the middle class. And then if they're paying more, starts to be more class differences. So my basic premise, and you're fine to disagree with this, is that in a fallen world, most ministries are going to fall towards, that are trying to address justice, are going to fall towards one of these parts of the triangle. Now, that's one of the frameworks. Now, most of the world is going to have either a race-centric culture, and this is kind of a picture of what a race-centric culture is. So a black, Latino, Asian church. So, and a good black church might have, upper class, rich black folk, middle class and lower class, and it becomes a mixing ground for that. So this is, the phrase that Martin Luther King Jr. said, that the most segregated hour in America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. So this is really the de facto way that churches work. And there's good reasons for that, and there's also bad reasons for this. One of the good reasons is it gives, Black and Latino folks a place where they can go, and it's just their own culture. The downside is that there's going to be challenges in social capital because they can get isolated from groups that have more collective social capital because of racism or other reasons. Now, that's a race-centric perspective. Now, there's another perspective which is a class-centric perspective, and I call this class-centric, but almost all the groups in the U.S. and generally most more conservative groups are going to be unconscious about it. Now, I talked about in class identity what the difference between conscious and unconscious, but unconscious means that they're going to have a strong lower class culture or middle class culture, but they're not going to be intentional about being lower class or upper class. I'm not really going to think about it. So some groups that I would say have been dominantly lower class, so groups that serve the poor like Salvation Army, rescue missions, they are really good at serving the poor. Pentecostals, historically, especially in Latin America and other places, they're the denominations of the poor. 12-step programs have been pretty effectively at serving the poor and broken. And then there's a lot of majority culture churches that are working to be multi-ethnic. Often, whenever they're multi-ethnic, I went to a multi-ethnic church that was predominantly upper middle class, and they, had Black and Latino and Asian folks, but the Black and Latino folks that were there were largely Black immigrants that came from upper class backgrounds in Africa, and that was an easier adjustment for them than to go to an African American church, and that's also common in campus ministries and sometimes Christian colleges where they're going to be most effective. Now, this isn't saying that a lower class group doesn't have any upper class folks or vice versa. What it just means is there's going to be a dominant culture. And often these groups tend to be white dominated just given the demographics of the U.S. Now, what really happens in most churches, though, is the reality is most churches tend to segregate by both race and class. So you'll have the large middle class Black megachurch, and then you'll have the smaller Black storefront church. I attended a Black storefront church for a good part of my life growing up. My dad was a pastor at a Black storefront church, and it was mainly low income folks who went there and working class folks, and that's very different than some other churches. So what I'm really trying to do is just describe, not to say, this is the way it should be. Now, what happens in a fallen world is these things tend to get played against each other. So there's this tendency to play race and class against each other. So, in the U.S., there's something called Affirmative Action, and that's where historically disadvantaged groups will get preferential treatment in certain things to offset that history. And what's happened is many conservatives have used class-based arguments as a tool to reverse affirmative action and limit policies addressing racism. And the same thing's been, done vice versa, where, there's a good number of countries that have something called affirmative access, which is class-based policies to address historical injustices. But what's interesting is in the U.S., the majority of people are both favorable towards affirmative action and affirmative access, especially if you combine the two together. So that's one of the tendencies. Now, the other is this gender-based culture. So as I mentioned, mainline denominations, Christian feminists will tend to just, look at gender as the one dimension. Now, the big challenge that we have is that you can't bridge to all groups. This is just a part of the fallen world. Now, we can create these theories in academia where we're going to be the perfect organization that is, perfectly just across race, class, and gender and all other dimensions. But the reality is, because we live in a fallen world, we have limitations. And part of what I'm going to try to do is to help explain, some of what that looks like on the ground and some of what you can do. So, we talked about ethnic identity development and we talked about class identity development. At the end of one of the papers, I talked about social identity development. So part of the reason why I simplified this into 4 stages is because you can go through these same stages across race, class, and gender. And what's important is to recognize the way living in a fallen world, we can get stuck in various stages. And I'll even talk about, some of mine. But 2 questions to think about are: what's the most common stage for your organization or tradition across each of these? So, you might be in an organization that is focused on serving the poor, and it's fairly long around, the class, identification and things along those lines, but it may not be as strong around race or, say, gender. Or you might be in a tradition that's very progressive along gender, but not on the other 2. So, just think about honestly, where is your collective, identity in that organization. But, looking at where you get stuck and where you need to move towards. And let me talk a little bit about where people often get stuck. So you start with unawareness, and then usually people are going to go down the stages most quickly in the area where they've experienced their own oppression. So if, you're a white woman, you're going to do gender, and you're going to become much more aware of gender injustice because you're experiencing it, right? For me, class was, where I went the deepest. And so, what happens is you start off and you're unaware, and then you become aware and you have, a lot of head knowledge. And then if you go to stage 3 where you're doing immersion, and, we talked about head, heart, and hands, what immersion is really doing is you really can't do immersion without, you can't do heart and hand learning unless you're actually doing it. It's like trying to learn to speak Spanish without ever speaking Spanish with people. You're not going to get that good at it. You can study it, but you're not going to get that good at it. You're not going to become fluent. And so, part of what happens is people will go and they'll go deep and they'll get stuck in stage 3. And this is what I did. I got really angry around social class. I was one of those self-righteous, social justice guys who's like, no, none of you care about the poor. You're all going to hell. I, went to a church that I was at and was, pretty judgmental at people. And ultimately, they didn't ask me to leave the church, but they told me that, that I was causing disruption. And it was because I was angry. I was an angry, poor white guy. And that'll happen across race. It can happen across gender. People have met folks along that. And the reality is, to a certain extent, that's part of the forgiveness process. If you've ever been deeply wounded, it's hard to, sometimes a miracle happens and you just forgive, just like cancer gets cured. But most often you have to go through the painful parts of acknowledging the pain, naming it. And sometimes, depending on the level of pain, that can take years or, a decade or so. For me, it took about a decade. And I was angry in this stage. And what I did is I tried to only emphasize, what people call it is they call it the victim contest. And I would try to argue, I've been victimized, more than you, because even though, racial groups historically have it, you just have no idea how poor I was. Or, other people will, say, oh, racism's, much worse. And you'll get into this victim contest. And that's really a path to hell, to be honest, because what happens is I've seen these groups and, you start off with a group of 20 and pretty soon it becomes a group of 10 and then it becomes a group of 5. And then pretty much it becomes a group of 20 people that are all a part of one. And each one of them is the most oppressed person in the group. And so, I've been a part of different movements and I've seen different movements that, I love rescue missions, and rescue missions aren't as far along, I would say, on race as, say, CCDA, the CCDA movement. But CCDA movement folks sometimes can get stuck in that competition of, who's been victimized the most. And And then, what happens is everyone starts judging people who are in stage 4, because you get stage 4 people, you can't figure out, are you, if you're a stage 4 person, does that mean, say someone's black stage 4, does that mean that they're just, ignorant of how much, injustice there is, or it's because they've actually forgiven and they see it all? So ultimately, what we need to do if we want to expand our ability to lead, we need to move through these stages across race, class, and gender, and that's going to help us progress. And then we can also help our organization move through these stages, because there's, what I've heard, John Maxwell likes to talk about the law of the lid, but the idea is that a level 7 leader can't really lead a level 8 leader. Well, the law of the lid applies across race, class, and gender. So if I am a level 8 leader or a level 7 leader, and I can only lead level set, I might be a level 9 leader among, people with my culture, but I might be a level 5 leader among, a different group. So as we grow in these areas, we can level up our leadership, and then that's going to help our whole organization and movements. So in the next talk, I'm going to go through really some of the details of my personal experience at Tech Mission and City Vision on these issues, because it's easy to look at these things through a theory, but it's much harder to understand just through a theory. I'm going to talk about some of the practical reasons why I believe a lot of these things are true. Thanks a lot.